Welcome to the Near Mint Gideon YouTube channel. I'm Minty, also known as Near Mint Gideon, and today we are going to be discussing Linvala, Shield of Seagate. This video isn't a deck tech, although there is a sample deck in the description if you so wish to peruse that. Today we're going to be talking more about the thought process I went through when I first saw the creature and how I thought about building the deck. So we're going to go through concepts as opposed to exactly what card you should be running in the deck. Let's take a look at her basic stats at a first glance. She's 3 mana, including 1 white and 1 blue. She's a 3/3, and she has flying. Those seem pretty good. All those stats seem actually above the curve, and already point to some possible strategies that you could run with the card. Let's read further about what this creature does and what the creature types are. Well, she's an angel and a wizard, which is a bit weird, being as her previous incarnations, if you like, her previous cards never mention her being a wizard before. Maybe, perhaps she went to Hogwarts or something. Both of those creature types, however, are pretty relevant, especially the wizard creature type, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that could lend itself to some strategies as well. Let's read the rest of her text. She clearly is a party girl. I mean, look how hyped that pigeon is. Her first paragraph of text refers to this. Not the pigeon, the fact that she's a party girl. If you have a full party, and that's a big if, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to basically detain something. So its activated abilities can't be activated, and it can't attack or block. This seems a little underwhelming because of the effort you have to go through to form a full party, and I'm not sure it's worth focusing on for this discussion. So let's read on in her text. Her final ability is the one that I'm most interested in. It states that if you sacrifice Linvala to this ability, you can give your creatures a choice of hexproof or indestructible until the end of turn. Now that ability is really good, and I want to compare it to something a little bit crazy. So to illustrate this, I want to compare it to Avacyn, Angel of Hope. Now that might sound completely bonkers, but I think there are some similar themes between Avacyn and Linvala that we can hopefully identify and use to our advantage. There are some benefits, I think, to running Linvala over Avacyn. First of all, you have an access to an additional colour, which is blue, whereas Avacyn is a mono-white creature, so you only have access to white cards if you're running Avacyn as your commander. Their effects are kind of similar. Avacyn obviously gives indestructible to all of your permanents, whereas Linvala only cares about your creatures. However, if you're running a very creature-heavy deck, like the one I'm proposing, I think that difference becomes negligible in most playgroups. We'll talk about the exceptions later on. The other thing that's really great about Linvala is that she gives indestructible or hexproof. So she actually can help you get around some of the removal that Avacyn struggles with, most notably targeted exile. But you're asking the question now, that's a one-time thing, Minty. I can only use the ability once, and then it's done. My commander is dead, and now I have to recast it. Well, do you? And this is where I think the deck becomes really interesting, because if we can constantly abuse or reuse Linvala's ability to give our stuff our choice of hexproof or indestructible, we kind of have this sort of mini Avacyn effect on a body that is much cheaper and easier to cast and easier to gain advantage in the early game. So how do I picture this deck? I picture this deck as a very creature-heavy deck that relies on the principles of the 3 Rs, and you'll have heard about these in school. So, reduce, reuse, recycle. We want to reduce Linvala's commander taxes by playing her from different zones, so either from our hand or our graveyard. We want to reuse her ability to constantly protect our team and recycle her and her buddies, or party buddies, from the graveyard to keep them protected. To put this plainly, this is going to be a blue-white recursion deck that focuses on Linvala's sacrifice ability to keep your creatures protected. Now, we don't have access to black, we only have access to blue and white, Black is traditionally the colour that you would use to recur things from your graveyard, especially creatures. However, white does a pretty good imitation of it, and I think that attribute of white is actually underplayed. So let's talk about some different spells that you could use to bring creatures back from the dead. You can use loads of different strategies, but the first one is using instants and sorceries. Some instants and sorceries you can see on screen are Breath of Life, 4 mana, bring something back. Defy Death, 5 mana, bring something back. Put some counters on it if it's an angel. That might come in handy actually in this deck because of the relevant creature type. And Miraculous Recovery, which is 5 mana, bring something back. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. The other strategy is using permanents to bring stuff back from your graveyard. So the 2 examples here I have are Elspeth Conquers Death, which when it gets to its 3rd saga story counter, brings a creature back from the dead and puts a +1/+1 counter on it. You can also get Planeswalkers, and my favourite, Karmic Guide. Now, if you're running Karmic Guide, you might as well run Revelark and a sack outlet like Altar of Dementia, and you can win the game by milling out your opponents with those 3 permanents on board. Another great creature that brings creatures out of the bin is Rhea Dawnbringer. Now, she is a good target for reanimation herself, as she's 9 mana, which is very costly. However, once you've got her out, you can constantly protect your team. When I say constantly, I mean once every turn cycle, because you can protect your team with Linvala's ability, and then Rhea on your upkeep will bring her back from the dead, and you have that shield again. Another creature that brings creatures back is Tashar. You can see them on screen. It gets back creatures that are 3 CMC or less when you cast a historic spell. You can really pack this deck full of historic spells. I've already mentioned 2. Historic spells are sagas, artifacts, and legendary spells. So if you pack this deck full of them, you will make great use out of Teshar's ability because you can constantly recur your commander and smaller creatures in your deck by just developing your board. It's a great value engine. Tashar is a really underplayed card, I think. 2 more then. Bruna reanimates a human or an angel when you cast it, and Artisan of Kozilek does a similar thing. Now, if you're running Bruna, you might as well run her counterpart. You can see her on screen here. And try and live that meld dream to get that crazy Eldrazi angel you can now see on screen. Another thing that white is actually really good at, and that's not a phrase you hear much in EDH, is pulling permanents out of the bin. And in fact, I think it's probably better than any other colour at bringing permanents back from the bin straight to the battlefield. Here's some spells and creatures that will do that for you, and are particularly good in this deck because we do have a mixture of permanent types. So we have lands, obviously, artifacts, creatures, so on and so forth. So, Profound Journey gets 2 permanents, 1 when it resolves and 1 when it rebounds on your upkeep. I really like this card, even though it has quite a pricey CMC. What you'll notice about these cards that bring back permanents is there's always a little condition, so you can't have it all your way. Profound Journey is about as close as it gets, but it is pricey at 7 mana. Sun Titan has the condition that it only brings back CMC 3 or less. However, it can bring back any permanent CMC 3 or less. So that includes lands and, importantly, our commander. So with a Sun Titan, you can bring your commander back very consistently and maybe even swing your Sun Titan into players that can block it by giving it indestructible with your commander and then bringing your commander back with its ability. Bringing back fetch lands with a Sun Titan is one of my favourite things to do. It's a really great way to ramp in colours that really struggle with land ramp. Did you know you can get a 1-time Sun Titan effect with Savine's Reclamation, and then you can flash it back later to get 2 more Sun Titan effects? Again, these are great with fetch lands and lands in your graveyard because they ramp you, and they ramp you in a way that actually most people don't like interacting with, which is through lands. These CMC 3 or less spells, and by that I mean things that return CMC 3 or less from your graveyard, are like the bread and butter of this deck, in my mind, because they constantly can bring Linvala back, and she can constantly protect your team, and that is the name of the game in this deck, and that is priceless. A real star player in this type of archetype is a Myria Shepherd. So when a planes enter the battlefield, it has landfall, and you can return a permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. That's only if it's a plains. If it's a different land, you get to return it to your hand. So you can return cheap stuff to your hand and very expensive stuff straight to the battlefield. If you can get a few landfall triggers in one turn, this can be game winning and game ending. And that's actually why this deck is built around having lots of lands enter the battlefield too. So it's a really unusual deck in the sense that it's blue-white recursion, which is unusual to start off with, and also it's got a lot of ability to trigger landfall because of a Mirror Shepherd in the deck. So stuff like Savine's Reclamation, if you get back lands with that, it's really good when a Mirror Shepherd's out, and Sun Titan is very good with this when a Mirror Shepherd's out. Finally, for white, I will show you some of the cards you could put in the deck that are more situational and more specific about what they bring back and when they bring it back. So one that I'd like to highlight here, which I really like, is Brought Back. It's 2 white mana, and it just returns 2 permanents to the battlefield, tapped, that were put there this turn. So this is great with fetch lands being like a crazy rampant growth that gets you 2 extra lands onto the battlefield, potentially. Also quite good with your commander in a fetch land, so you can get back the fetch land and your commander. It's a really good card, but it is quite situational. Now we've talked about white, let's talk about why you might want to run blue, because that isn't slacking in the graveyard recursion department either. Archaeomancer brings back your board wipes and your reanimation spells from the graveyard to your hand, meaning you can cast them again and get your creatures back from your graveyard. So that's a really good include. It's also a wizard, so, you know, wizards are cool. I really like Scholar of the Lost Trove, which casts instants, sorceries, or artifacts for free out of your bin when it enters the battlefield. It'd be good if you can get your hands on a copy of this one, because there's a limited supply because it was part of the Jumpstart, and there was a whole thing with the printing issues and stuff. So if you can get your hands on a Scholar of the Lost Trove, that's great and would work really well in this deck, I think. Another thing that recurs stuff from your graveyard is Emry, Lurker of the Lock. It's a great way of getting artifacts back, and there are some really good artifacts that help with recurring stuff from your graveyard. So you can see 3 on screen here: Godfarer's Gift, Sword of Light and Shadow, and Mimic Vat. Now, maybe Mimic Vat is a bit of a cheat, but it's very good in this deck, and it's very good at stealing your opponent's stuff as well. I really like Mimic Vat, and I should use it in more decks. Sword of Light and Shadow works great with your commander. If you've got something you can strap it to and swing with it, you can constantly get your commander back to your hand and keep casting her from there, because again, she's only 3 mana. I want to quickly mention board wipes here. Board wipes are probably the place where this deck is strongest. I really like the recursion aspect of the deck, but I think if you wanted to build the strongest version of this deck, you would just pack it full of board wipes and pack it full of creatures. Because Linvala makes your creatures indestructible, you can turn very cheap board wipes into one-sided board wipes and gain a load of advantage from that. I think that leads to some pretty frustrating gameplay, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like Avacyn as a commander, because it ends up being cast Avacyn, wipe the board, or even blow up everyone's lands, and that's a frustrating play pattern for your opponents to play against. So I've got a lower number of board wipes, but you certainly could increase the number and make your deck more powerful doing so, but just be prepared that it will be a real grind if you do that. So, what else should you put in this deck? Well, it's really up to you. I would suggest you want to fill it with small creatures that help you fill your graveyard and keep your hand full. I'd also suggest running some equipments, both of which you can see on screen now. Equipments are great in this deck because Linvala has flying and comes down quite early, so you can definitely smack someone and get the advantage from the equipment. Small creatures are obviously great because you can constantly recur them with your CMC 3 or less recursion engines, and the small creatures get in for damage, which work well with the equipments as well. Like I alluded to at the beginning, or all the way through this video, I've got a small sort of wizard sub-theme in the deck. My favourite wizard is obviously Azami, who's an amazing card and will draw you a ton of cards. If you go over hand size in this deck, you don't care, because you're going to discard some really big stuff to the graveyard, or stuff that's going to gain you advantage later on in the graveyard, so drawing cards is a great way of filling your graveyard. I do run Avacyn, Angel of Hope in this deck, just as a big, dangerous body that people have to deal with, otherwise it's going to win me the game. And it works very well with the board wipe strategies and reanimation. But you could run any other big, scary creature, and that would do very well in this deck too. So long as it's gaining you some advantage by being on the board, that's kind of where you want to be at with this deck, because you want to be able to protect those things. So Avacyn is great in this deck. I think you could perhaps run, if you wanted to be really nasty, you could run the blue Praetor, Jinkataxis, or the white Praetor, Elish Norn, and that would really make your opponents miserable, because they would have a really hard time dealing with either of those because of Linvala's constant recursion. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is more a discussion about strategy more than a prescriptive deck tech. I'd love to know what you think of the strategy in the comments down below. What did I miss? What are your takes on blue-white recursion? I'd love to hear from you, so let me know in the comments down below. There's a deck list in the description below the video, as I said previously, but don't expect that to be constant. I'm going to hopefully update it and change it as I hone and tune the deck. If you want to see the deck in action, I did a live stream with the Canada Geeks, and that's in the description below, or in a pinned comment, depending on where I put it. So go check them out. They've got a great channel. Brennan does a really good job over there, so it was really nice to be on the stream and play this awesome deck that I'm really happy with and see some of the stuff that it could do. So if you want to check out my build of the deck, go ahead and go over there and see them. I just want to reiterate that this is just an idea of how to build the deck. If you want to copy mine exactly, go for it. But I would really, really like to see some cool interaction that I've missed in this sort of blue-white recursion style deck. Finally, if you like the video, do the usual YouTube stuff and like and comment below. Subscribe if you want to see more. If you'd like to see more of my content, you can check me out on Twitter and Instagram at NearMintGideon. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Minty, also known as NearMintGideon, and I'll see you next time. Bye.